Let me just say up front, I'm not proud of what I've seen. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this, other than the fact that maybe someone out there will believe me, because I'm struggling to believe it myself. My mom isn't like this. She's always been the typical, strict but loving type, and up until last night, I thought I knew her. I thought I knew what she did during her evenings when she locked herself in the basement, leaving me strict instructions to stay upstairs. But last night, I broke the rules. Last night, I learned why she kept that door locked. To get this all down, let me start from the beginning. I live with my mom in a 2-story house in the middle of a pretty boring neighborhood. She's always worked late, often coming home around midnight, bags under her eyes, and that exhausted but determined look that she always wore so well. She'd tell me, "It's for us, to make sure we're taken care of." I never questioned it, never pushed for more information, even though something felt off. See, a few years ago, my dad disappeared. I was told he left us. No note, no warning. Just gone. One day, he was there. The next, he wasn't. I was only 15 at the time, and I spent years blaming myself, wondering if I'd done something to drive him away. But my mum told me that he wasn't worth our tears. She was always cold about it, quick to shut me down when I asked about him. So when the late nights started, I figured maybe it was her way of coping, throwing herself into work to distract herself from whatever grief or anger she held on to. But then there were the locked doors, the weird smells, the strange hours she kept on weekends. She'd vanish, telling me she was meeting a friend, but never specifying who. I got used to it, until I started noticing some changes. Over the past year, her behavior shifted. She became secretive in a way that felt heavier. She kept her phone on her at all times, guarding it like it held the codes to a missile or something. Sometimes I'd hear her talking in the middle of the night, murmuring in a low, almost feral tone that I didn't recognize. I'd asked her once who she was talking to, and she snapped at me with a look in her eyes that, I don't know, it wasn't her. And then there was the basement.
The basement was our off-limits area, her personal sanctuary. I'd only been down there a handful of times as a kid, mostly when she needed me to grab something from storage. But she started keeping the door locked all the time, and I never had the key. When I'd asked why, she'd say things like, "It's dangerous down there," or "It's nothing for you to worry about." But I worried. Every time she'd go down there, I'd hear strange noises like scraping or thumping. And then there was the smell. A sick, metallic stench that would waft up the stairs, lingering in the hallway like a warning. It was bad enough that I'd gag, coughing as I tried to keep my curiosity in check. Last night, I couldn't do it anymore. I needed to know. I needed to see what she was hiding. She had gone out again around 10 p.m., giving me her usual instructions. Stay upstairs, don't answer the door, and whatever you do, don't go in the basement. But this time, I noticed something she didn't. In her hurry, she'd left the basement door slightly open, the lock dangling from the latch. It felt like a sign. I waited until I saw her car disappear down the road, and then I crept downstairs. My heart was pounding as I reached the door, the overwhelming stench almost pushing me back. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, pulled me forward. I pushed the door open, peering into the dark staircase that led down into the abyss. My hands were shaking as I flicked on the light, taking slow, hesitant steps down the stairs. The smell got stronger, and I had to cover my nose with my sleeve, fighting the urge to throw up. It smelled like iron, like something rotting, like death. As I reached the bottom, I saw the room. The walls were covered in thick plastic, the kind you'd see in horror movies where someone's trying to avoid leaving a trace. There was a table in the middle, and on it, God, on it was something wrapped in a black tarp, something large and bulky. There were stains on the floor, dark, nearly black stains that looked like they'd been scrubbed 1,000 times but could never really come clean. I thought about leaving. I thought about running, forgetting what I'd seen, and pretending that my mum was just cleaning or working on some bizarre project. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was under that tarp was wrong. It was heavy, and as I got closer, I saw a pool of liquid around it, a thick, dark liquid that looked suspiciously like blood. My breath caught in my throat and I reached out, fingers trembling as I pulled back the tarp. What I saw, I'll never unsee it. It was a body, a human body, stripped of clothes, covered in slashes and cuts, some old, some fresh. Their face was covered, but the rest, I could see the wounds, the brutality in each cut. My mum's basement had a dead person in it, a person who had been tortured, brutalized in ways I couldn't even begin to process. I staggered back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this person? Why were they here? And why would my mum do this? I stumbled, nearly falling as I backed away. But then I noticed something on the wall, something that made my blood run cold. There were photographs, dozens of them, pinned up like some kind of twisted gallery. Photos of people, men, women, young, old, all of them looking normal, just living their lives, completely unaware. And in every photo, there was a little red X drawn over their faces. My heart felt like it would burst as I scanned the photos, recognizing some of the faces from news reports, missing persons cases that had been plastered all over the local news. These people weren't just missing, they were here. They had been here, in my mother's basement, laid out on that table, tortured, killed. And then, I saw it. The one photo that made my knees buckle. It was a picture of me. My own face, circled in red, a date scribbled underneath that hadn't come yet, a date that was next month. I don't know how long I stood there staring at my own face, seeing myself through the eyes of a stranger. A stranger who lived under the same roof, who made me dinner, who kissed me goodnight. I heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, and I felt the icy grip of terror as I turned to see her standing there, her eyes cold and unrecognizable. She held a small, rusty knife in her hand, tilting her head as she looked at me. "You shouldn't have come down here," she said, her voice low and controlled, like she was talking to an animal she was about to put down. My legs moved before my mind could catch up. I ran, shoving past her, scrambling up the stairs, hearing her footsteps behind me, slow but steady. I don't know how I made it to my room. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely turn the lock on my door. My heart was pounding, every thud echoing like a drum, drowning out every thought except one. I had to get out. But it wasn't as easy as just running away. She was my mom, this was my house, and the idea of her being, whatever she was, it didn't feel real. I kept hoping I'd wake up, that the bloodstains on the floor and the pictures on the wall would disappear. But when I looked down, my hands were still covered in smudges of that dark, dried blood from when I pulled back the tarp. My brain couldn't process it. It was like my thoughts were hitting a brick wall. This wasn't some stranger. This wasn't a monster hiding in the dark. This was my mom, the same mom who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd packed my lunches, who'd cried at my high school graduation. The idea that she could do those things, that she could hurt people like that, it made me feel sick. I had to tell someone. I had to tell anyone. But the moment I reached for my phone, a terrifying thought hit me. She might be listening. She might be right outside my door, just waiting for me to make a move. And if she heard me calling for help, I had no doubt she'd find a way to stop me. I stood there frozen, staring at my locked door, my mind running through all the times she'd insisted I stay away from the basement, the way she'd snapped at me whenever I asked about her work, or why she'd come home with cuts on her hands or bags under her eyes. All those little things I'd brushed off as nothing suddenly took on a whole new meaning. There was no one I could tell without sounding insane, and even if they believed me, what could they do? Who would believe that someone as ordinary and quiet as my mom was hiding bodies in the basement? But the proof was right there. The tarp, the blood, the photographs. I had to leave. I had to run. I cracked open my door, holding my breath as I peeked out into the hallway. It was quiet, too quiet. No sound of the TV downstairs, no creaks from her footsteps. Just this oppressive silence that felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to move. I tiptoed down the hall, slipping into my mum's room. Her phone was on the nightstand, the screen dark. She was usually glued to it, but tonight she'd left it here, like she didn't need it anymore. I grabbed it, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it, hoping she hadn't changed the password. The screen lit up, and the first thing I saw was a string of messages, all from a contact saved as Mr. Black. There were dozens of them, going back months, messages that made my stomach twist as I scrolled through them. Got the latest target, will send details soon. Payment received, I'll be ready on Saturday. Make sure the cleanup's handled, we don't want a repeat of last time.
Every single message confirmed what I'd seen downstairs, the horrible truth that I was trying to deny. My mum wasn't just killing people. She was doing it for someone else. She was getting paid to do it. I couldn't look anymore. I wanted to hurl the phone across the room, but I needed proof. I took photos of the messages, screenshotting as much as I could. My hands were sweaty, and every time I heard the faintest creak, I froze, expecting to see her standing in the doorway, that knife in her hand, waiting for me. When I was done, I dropped the phone back on her nightstand and backed out of the room. My mind was racing with a million questions I didn't want answers to. Who was Mr. Black? How long had she been doing this? And why? I tiptoed downstairs, avoiding the spot on the stairs that always creaked. I didn't dare turn on the lights, afraid that any sound, any flicker of movement would bring her straight to me. I had to keep it together. I had to stay calm. I made it to the front door, and I was almost out when I heard her voice. "You're not leaving, are you?" Her tone was sweet, almost playful, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned slowly, seeing her standing at the end of the hallway, bathed in shadow. She was holding something small, a knife, no, a scalpel, the kind they use in surgery. Her smile was faint, barely there, but her eyes, they looked empty, cold. "Where were you going?" she asked, taking a step toward me. "It's late." My mouth went dry, and I tried to stammer out some excuse, but the words wouldn't come. She kept walking, that scalpel glinting in the dim light, and I felt like a rabbit caught in a trap, helpless and frozen. "I know you saw the basement," she whispered, her voice soft but sharp enough to slice through the silence. "I saw you go down there. I was watching." I backed up against the door, my hand fumbling for the doorknob, but she was faster. She lunged forward, grabbing my wrist with a grip like iron, twisting it until I cried out. Her face was inches from mine, her breath hot on my skin. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't want you to find out like this. I wanted to keep you safe from it all. But you just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" I stared at her, barely able to breathe, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But she had me pinned, her grip like a vice, and I could feel the edge of the scalpel pressing against my throat. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper in my ear. "Do you know why I do it?" I shook my head, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. "I do it for us," she murmured, a strange, almost tender look in her eyes. "Everything I do is for you, to keep you safe, to protect you from the people out there who would hurt us." Her words didn't make any sense, but the look in her eyes, it terrified me. She truly believed what she was saying, like she was trying to convince herself that what she was doing was noble, that she wasn't just some monster lurking in the shadows. "Mom, please," I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. She smiled, a twisted, loving smile that sent chills down my spine. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you. But you have to promise me something." I nodded, desperate to get out of her grip, to escape this nightmare. "You won't tell anyone," she said, her voice soft but deadly serious. You won't breathe a word of this to anyone, because if you do, well, she trailed off, her eyes flicking toward the basement door. Let's just say I won't have a choice. The implication was clear. If I told anyone, if I tried to leave, I'd end up just like those people under the tarp. She released my wrist, stepping back, her gaze never leaving mine. Go to bed, she said, her voice gentle, like she was tucking me in for the night. And remember, I'm always watching. I stumbled up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest, feeling like I'd just escaped death itself. As I reached my room and locked the door, I slumped to the floor, tears streaming down my face as the full horror of what I'd just seen, what I'd just heard, sank in. This wasn't just some nightmare. This was real. My mom was a killer. And now, she knew that I knew.
I didn't sleep that night. Every little creak, every gust of wind against the window made me flinch, expecting to see her face on the other side of my door, watching me. My mind wouldn't stop replaying her words, her tone, that look in her eyes when she said she was protecting me. I kept staring at the screenshots I'd taken from her phone, reading the messages from Mr. Black over and over, as if trying to decode some hidden meaning in them. But there was no hidden meaning. It was all right there, raw and horrifying. She was getting paid to kill people, to torture them, and to do God knows what else. She was keeping these memories, these trophies, right in our house, and she thought she was doing it for me. When morning finally came, I heard her moving around downstairs like it was any other day. She cooked breakfast, the smell of eggs and bacon wafting up through the floorboards. It would have been comforting, normal on any other day. But now it just felt sickening. I knew I couldn't stay in the house alone with her. I had to get out, even if just to clear my head. So I got dressed, threw my phone in my pocket, and forced myself to go downstairs. She was waiting for me at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee like she hadn't spent the night threatening me with a scalpel. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of soft, motherly smile she'd always given me. But now it felt like a mask, a cruel imitation. "Good morning, honey," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "I made you breakfast." I could barely look at her. "Thanks," I muttered, grabbing a piece of toast and stuffing it in my mouth, just for an excuse not to talk. She watched me with those eyes, those same cold, calculating eyes that had looked at me with a scalpel in her hand. I could feel her gaze boring into me, searching for any sign that I might betray her, that I might say something to someone. It felt like she was reading my mind, dissecting me, breaking me down into pieces, just like she'd done with those people in the basement. "What are your plans today?" she asked too casually. My mind went blank. Probably just go for a walk," I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. "Clear my head." She nodded, taking another sip of her coffee. "That sounds nice. It's good to get some fresh air. Clears the mind." I could feel her eyes on me as I walked toward the door, my hands clammy as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare show even a hint of fear. I had to act like everything was fine, like I wasn't planning to run the first chance I got. As soon as I was out the door, I broke into a jog, heading straight for the park a few blocks away. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with every possible scenario, every horrible thought of what she might do if she realized I was trying to get help. I found an empty bench in the park, sat down, and pulled out my phone. I'd barely slept, my head was pounding, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I searched through the photos again, wondering if anyone would believe me, if the police would even listen to some kid rambling about his mom being a dark web killer. I didn't know where to start, who to trust, or if I'd even survive if I told anyone. I tried calling a friend, someone who'd been close to me for years. Maybe they'd believe me, maybe they'd help. But as the phone rang, doubt crept in. Could I risk it? What if my mum found out? What if she came after them too? Before I could talk myself out of it, someone sat down next to me on the bench. I jumped, my phone slipping out of my hand, But then I saw it was just an old man feeding a flock of pigeons. "Everything okay, son?" he asked, glancing over at me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to laugh, or maybe cry. If only he knew. I'm fine," I stammered, grabbing my phone and shoving it back in my pocket. He didn't pry any further, just nodded and continued tossing crumbs to the pigeons. But something about his presence, his quiet, calm demeanor, made me feel a bit safer, even if just for a moment. As I sat there, trying to collect my thoughts, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting to see a message from my friend, or maybe a notification from some news app. But it was a text from her, from my mum. "Come home, now." I stared at the screen, my heart skipping a beat. How did she know I was here? How did she know what I was doing? Panic surged through me, and I glanced around, half expecting to see her watching me from behind a tree or across the street. But there was no sign of her. Just normal people going about their day, oblivious to the nightmare I was living. The old man looked at me, his brows knitting together. "You sure you're okay, son?" I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, I'm fine, thanks." He gave me a skeptical look, but didn't press any further. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly as I started the walk back to the house. Every step felt heavier, like I was walking toward my own execution. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say, how to act, how to survive whatever awaited me at home. When I got back, she was waiting for me in the living room, sitting on the couch with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as I walked in, her expression calm but her eyes cold, calculating. "Did you enjoy your walk?" she asked, her voice laced with that same unsettling sweetness. I swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, it was nice." She patted the seat next to her, gesturing for me to sit down. I hesitated, but I didn't dare disobey. I sat down, feeling the cushions sink under my weight, my heart pounding as I braced myself for whatever was coming. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "About last night, about what you saw." My throat tightened, and I could feel sweat prickling my skin. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "It was upsetting for you, wasn't it?" she continued, her tone sympathetic, like she was talking about a bad grade on a test or a rough day at school. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I understand," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was light, but it felt like a weight pressing down on me. "It's a lot to process, and I don't expect you to understand right away." Her voice was calm, almost hypnotic, as if she was trying to lull me into some false sense of security. But I could feel the tension underneath, the unspoken threat lurking in every word. "I just want you to know," she said, squeezing my shoulder, "that I'm doing this for us, for our family. Everything I do is to keep you safe." I forced myself to nod, swallowing the bile that was rising in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there and listen to her twisted justifications. But I couldn't. She had me cornered, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. "Do you understand, honey?" she asked, her voice dripping with that same sickly sweet tone. "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I understand." She smiled, a satisfied, almost motherly smile that made my skin crawl. "Good. I'm glad. Because I need you to trust me. I need you to promise me that you won't tell anyone about what you saw." Her gaze bore into me, unblinking, waiting for my answer. I could feel the weight of her threat hanging in the air, the unspoken warning that if I crossed her, I'd end up just like those people in the basement. I promise," I choked out, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Her smile widened and she patted my shoulder like she was proud of me. "That's my good boy." She stood up, her posture relaxed, as if a great weight had been lifted off her shoulders. "Now why don't you go relax? Take some time to clear your head. I'll take care of everything." I nodded numbly, my mind blank as I watched her walk away, her footsteps fading as she disappeared down the hallway. I was left alone, sitting on the couch, trapped in a silent horror I couldn't escape.
I knew I had to do something. I knew that if I stayed here, if I kept pretending, it was only a matter of time before she'd decide I was a liability, a loose end she couldn't afford to keep around. But how do you escape a monster when that monster is your own mother? I spent the rest of the day locked in my room, every nerve in my body on edge. My mind was like a storm, swirling with questions and panic, every instinct screaming at me to get out. But I couldn't just walk out the door. She'd be watching, waiting for me to slip up, to give her any reason to do whatever she had in mind for me. Night came, and I lay in bed with my eyes wide open, listening to the sounds of the house settling, every creak and rustle sending jolts of panic through me. My door was locked, but it didn't feel like enough. Nothing felt like enough. Then, just after midnight, I heard her footsteps outside my room, soft but deliberate. I held my breath, watching the sliver of light under the door, praying she wouldn't come in. The footsteps stopped, and I could feel her standing there, just inches away, separated by nothing more than a thin wooden door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she'd hear it. And then, slowly, the footsteps faded down the hall. I waited, counting every second, until I was sure she was gone, then forced myself out of bed. My hand was shaking as I unlocked the door and slipped out into the hallway, keeping my steps as silent as possible. I had to be quick to get what I needed and get out. There was only one way I was going to survive this, and that was if I had proof, something undeniable that I could take to the police. The basement door was open, the darkness below seeming to reach up like a living thing, as if it was just waiting for me. My stomach turned, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get down there. I needed to see it again, to make sure I hadn't imagined it, that this wasn't some twisted nightmare. I crept down the stairs, the floorboards groaning under my weight, every sound magnified in the silence. The smell hit me halfway down, that same thick metallic stench like rotting meat and rust. It took everything in me to keep moving, to keep breathing.
When I reached the bottom, the dim light in the basement flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. The plastic sheets were still there, stained and tattered, hanging like ghostly curtains. The table in the center was empty now, but the dark, sticky stains on the floor were still there, remnants of whatever horrors she'd committed down here. I pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to scan the room. There was a shelf against the wall, covered with boxes and jars filled with things I didn't want to think about, things that looked like parts. Small, unrecognizable chunks of flesh preserved in glass, little reminders of whatever dark ritual she was part of. Then I noticed a small door in the corner of the basement, one I'd never seen before. It was half hidden behind a stack of boxes, its surface scratched and worn. My heart was racing, every instinct telling me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. I was too far in. I needed to know. I pushed the boxes aside, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. It was cold, almost freezing, like it hadn't been touched in years. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, and opened the door. Inside was a small, cramped room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, dusty and covered in cobwebs, each drawer labeled with numbers and dates. I opened the nearest one, pulling out a stack of papers. My stomach dropped as I scanned the pages. Medical records, IDs, photos, all of people I recognized from missing persons reports. I rifled through them, my hands trembling as I pulled out photo after photo, each one a face frozen in time, unaware that they'd been marked for death. There were notes too, detailed descriptions of each person, their routines, their habits, the times they'd be alone. It was like reading a hit list, carefully organized and catalogued. And then, at the bottom of the stack, I found one with my name on it. My own face staring back at me, circled in red, with notes scribbled around the edges. Potential liability. Growing suspicious. Needs monitoring. I staggered back, the paper slipping from my fingers as I tried to process it. She'd been planning this, watching me, waiting for the moment when I'd become a threat. My own mother had been planning to kill me. I stumbled out of the small room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind was a blur, every thought tangled in a knot of terror and disbelief. I'd known she was dangerous, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. As I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something else, a large metal cabinet in the corner, secured with a heavy padlock. My gut twisted, but I couldn't resist. I had to see. I grabbed a hammer from a nearby shelf, smashing at the lock until it broke, the sound echoing through the basement like a gunshot. Inside the cabinet were bags, thick black garbage bags, each one knotted and bloated like it was full of something heavy. The smell was overpowering, a rancid, sour stench that made my stomach churn. I reached in, my hand shaking, and pulled open the nearest bag. What I saw inside, I'll never forget. It was a human head, eyes wide and staring, mouth twisted in a silent scream. The skin was pale, almost grey, and the hair was matted with blood. I stumbled back, dropping the bag, bile rising in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. These were her victims. She'd kept their heads as trophies. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. My mind was blank, every thought drowned out by the sheer horror of what I'd uncovered. And then I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor. My heart stopped as I realized she'd come back, that she was standing right above me, that any second now she'd come down and find me here, in the middle of her gruesome collection.
I frantically shoved everything back into the cabinet, slamming the door shut and backing into the shadows. I could hear her footsteps approaching, moving toward the basement door. The light at the top of the stairs flicked on, casting a long shadow down into the room. "Are you down there?" she called, her voice echoing through the silence, that same twisted sweetness laced with something darker, something predatory. I didn't move, didn't breathe, pressing myself against the wall as her footsteps descended the stairs, slow and deliberate. She stopped halfway down, scanning the room with a look that was both calm and calculating, her gaze sweeping over every inch of the basement. "I know you're down here," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I told you not to come back down here, didn't I?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I could see her now, standing at the bottom of the stairs, her face expressionless, but her eyes. There was something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. It was like she was sizing me up, deciding whether I was worth the trouble. "I know you're scared," she murmured, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But you have to understand, honey, this is for the best. It's for us. Everything I do for you." She took a step forward, her hand reaching into her pocket, pulling out something small and metallic. The scalpel, the same one she'd held against my throat the night before. "Come out," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "Let's talk about this. There's no need to be afraid." I could feel my legs trembling, every instinct screaming at me to run, to do anything but stay here in this room with her. But I knew that if I moved, if I made even the slightest sound, she'd come after me. "Fine," she said after a long, agonizing moment. "Have it your way. But remember, I'm always watching." She turned, her footsteps echoing as she climbed back up the stairs, the light flicking off as she left me alone in the darkness. I waited, counting every second until I was sure she was gone, until I couldn't hear her anymore. Then, as quietly as I could, I climbed up the stairs, every step feeling like it might be my last. I slipped out of the basement, into the hallway, and bolted for the front door. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I didn't care if she heard me. I had to get out. I threw the door open, sprinting into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran, not daring to look back, not daring to stop until I was as far away from that house as possible. I ran through the empty streets, not stopping until I was far from my house, lungs burning and legs numb from the sprint. My brain was still in a fog, caught between panic and disbelief. I couldn't even process where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't go back, not ever. I finally ducked into a 24-hour diner, collapsing into a booth at the back, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, every horrible detail from the basement flashing through my head. The blood, the bodies, the smell, and that cold look in her eyes when she'd come down those stairs, calling my name like she was trying to coax a scared animal out of hiding. I pulled out my phone, staring at the screenshots I'd taken of the messages from Mr. Black. They felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare. I scrolled through them again and again, trying to make sense of it all, to convince myself that someone, anyone, would believe me. After a few minutes, I opened a new message and typed a single word: help. I sent it to my closest friend, hoping he'd respond, that he'd be awake, that he'd understand somehow. I waited, each second stretching out like an eternity, until finally my phone buzzed with his reply. What's going on? Are you okay? I couldn't explain everything in a text, so I sent him the photos, the messages, the pictures of the missing people, everything I'd managed to capture. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hit send, but I forced myself to do it. He needed to see, to understand what I was dealing with. After a long pause, he replied, "Where are you?" I texted him the address of the diner, and he promised he'd be there soon. I sat in the booth, staring at the door, half expecting to see my mom walk in at any moment, her expression calm and unbothered, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just threatened to kill me. 20 minutes later, he arrived, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock as he slid into the booth across from me. "Dude, what the hell is all this?" he whispered, glancing around like he was afraid someone would overhear. I swallowed, trying to find the words to explain it, but every time I opened my mouth, the memories of that basement came flooding back, and I couldn't bring myself to say it. It felt too big, too terrifying to even put into words. "It's real," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you saw, it's all real." He stared at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and horror. Your mom did all this?" I nodded, my throat tight as I fought back tears. She said she was doing it for me, that she was protecting me." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, shaking his head in disbelief. "We have to go to the cops. This is insane. She can't get away with this." I wanted to agree, but the thought of going to the police terrified me. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was making it up, or worse, that I was somehow involved? And even if they did believe me, what if she found out? What if she came after me before they could stop her? But there was no other choice. I couldn't go back home. I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. I nodded, my hands trembling as I agreed. "Okay, let's go." We left the diner and got into his car, driving to the nearest police station. The entire way, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following us, watching us. I could still feel her hand on my shoulder, her voice in my ear, telling me she was doing it all for me. It felt like she was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. When we got to the police station, we went inside, and I told them everything. I showed them the photos, the messages, every piece of evidence I had. They listened, their expressions grim as I recounted everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned. They took notes, asking me questions, pressing me for details, but the whole time I felt like I was drifting, like I was watching it all from a distance. Eventually, one of the officers took me aside, his face serious as he looked me in the eye. "We're going to check out your house," he said, "but you need to stay here just in case. We'll keep you safe." I nodded numbly, my mind barely processing his words. All I could think about was what they'd find down there, the horrors hidden beneath that basement. And what would happen when they confronted her? Would she lie? Would she try to talk her way out of it? Or would she fight back? Hours passed, each one feeling longer than the last. My friend stayed with me, keeping me grounded, reminding me that I wasn't alone, that this nightmare would end. But every time the door opened, I jumped, half expecting to see her walking in, her face twisted with anger and betrayal. Finally, the officer returned, his expression grim as he sat down across from me. "We found what you described," he said, his voice quiet. "It's worse than we expected. Far worse. But there's something else." A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing at my friend before looking back at me. "Your mother. She's gone. We searched the house, the basement, the surrounding area. There's no sign of her." My heart stopped, a wave of cold terror washing over me. But she was just there. She was at the house." He nodded, his expression serious. "We know. But she's disappeared. We're issuing a warrant for her arrest. But until we find her, you're going to need to be careful. We'll put you in a safe place, somewhere she can't find you." I barely heard his words, my mind reeling with the implications. She was out there, somewhere, and she knew that I'd betrayed her, that I'd exposed her secrets. And now I was on her list. They placed me in a safe house, somewhere hidden, with a new phone and strict instructions to stay inside, to keep my location secret. But I knew it was only a matter of time. She'd find me. She always did. She'd spent her whole life hunting people down, planning their every move. She knew how to disappear, how to slip through the cracks. Days turned into weeks, and every moment felt like a countdown, like I was waiting for the inevitable. I barely slept, every noise outside sending me into a panic, every shadow a reminder of the monster lurking just out of sight. Then, one night, I received a message on my new phone, a number I didn't recognize. I opened it, my heart pounding as I read the words on the screen. "You can't hide from me, honey. I'll always be watching. And when you least expect it, I'll come for you." My blood ran cold, my entire body frozen in terror. I wanted to believe it was a prank, that it wasn't really her. But I knew better. I knew that she was out there, waiting, biding her time. And one day, she'd come for me. The police never found her. The safe house changed locations every few months, each move leaving me more isolated, more paranoid, but nothing ever made me feel safe. I knew she was still out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. It's been years now, and every night I lie awake, wondering if tonight will be the night. If tonight will be the moment she finally keeps her promise.